afternoon. I know it's been a long day. We're almost there. You're showing a lot of resilience. Really appreciate you all being here and joining the conversation. As was said, my name is James Patton. I've worked in community-based conflict resolution and development for 25 years in dozens of countries, and actually got to know JWF about 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, when I received funding from JWF for some work with women of faith in community-based reconciliation in Colombia before the Havana peace process. So I'm very grateful to be back with JWF over a decade later and continue that collaboration. A few brief comments. Back in 2010, 2011, I was with the State Department as a stability operations officer, and I was in South Sudan. I was up in northern Bahr al-Ghazal near Darfur. And my role at the time was to be an election observer. And I was sitting in these little dark buildings in these communities helping people just watch the counting of ballots. Now, this was a time when politicians and civil society members were promoting the idea across what was then southern Sudan that separation from the North was the single best remedy for decades of violence and suffering at the hands of what is now Sudan, the people in the North. But as we counted the ballots, and 99% of the ballots went for independence during the independence referendum, every time a community member came across a ballot for unity to stay with the North, there was this great celebration. And I found that completely incongruous. I was trying to understand why, you were all saying it's a terrible thing, we have to separate. And they said, yes, but every time we find a vote for unity, it proves that this process has been free and fair. And they knew that that was essential to demonstrate to the world that this brand new democracy, the youngest country in the world, was legitimate. And so they found that to be more exciting than the fact that 99% of the votes were for independence. 2 years ago, I was in Utah teaching a group of students from around the country, and one of them brought up to me the challenge that she was feeling, college student, right now with our own political process in the United States. And put succinctly, she said, I have no political home. One party represents for me my environmental perspective, and another party represents my reproductive rights perspective. And I can't choose. And we had this long conversation about the fact that it used to be civil society would push ideas up into platforms through representation that would then manifest in legislation. And now she was feeling that because of power politics and the importance that one party hold power over the other party, it had inverted that relationship. And the parties themselves were pushing platforms down at people, sometimes with loyalty, formal or informal loyalty tests embedded in them, oftentimes very illogical platforms that don't connect. And she felt she had nowhere to go to be heard in the United States in terms of our own political process. The parties were actively working in her mind to eliminate diversity in society for their own power, rather than to promote it and seek nuance in legislation. So it is true that democracy has never been anything but deeply flawed. Among the foundation of all of our democracies are littered the bricks of injustice, corruption, disenfranchisement, and myriad other failures. But a functioning democracy is not and is not meant to be an experiment in perfection. A functioning democracy is meant to be an experiment in improvement. The failures of the promise of democracy are both a lament and an opportunity. Democracy understands and actually has enshrined within its institutions the idea that we get things wrong, and it's meant to change and adapt over time. It illuminates a practical hope that we can have difficult dialogues that will guide us from the inevitable conflict of living in human society across difference towards more fair institutions and structures and social relationships that are better for more people. rather than deteriorating into absolutism, authoritarianism, and unfortunately, in some of my work, exclusivist and oppositional bloodshed. Now, in 2022, Freedom House described democracy as a governing system based on the will and consent of the governed, institutions that are accountable to all citizens, adherence to the rule of law, and respect for human rights. So accountability, rule of law, human rights, and consent, which are all principles that emerge in all definitions of democracy, including within the United Nations system. The institutions of democracy, as well as those core ideals that uphold them, are at present groaning under polarization. I don't think that's really in any debate. Perhaps the most nuanced measure of global democracy is produced by a group called VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg, and it applies around 600 attributes of democracy. And I'll spare you, read the report. It's really, it's informative and also startling. But some of the highlights include the fact that 72% of the population of the world now lives in autocracies, which is the highest since 1978. And the average levels of democracy for global citizens has retreated to 1985 levels, which is before the end of the Cold War. So that's where we are. Those who are given power, including through democratic process, are seduced by the temptation to erode controls on their power. And I don't mean this as any kind of partisan attack or a moral judgment. This is inherent to the human condition, right? But I mean it in very practical terms with respect to the careful architecture that surrounds democratic institutions, which acknowledges and responds to this temptation by insulating popular governance against power consolidation, corruption, and other abuses. But when people lose faith that their system of governance can help them, they either turn from those institutions, like the young lady in Utah, or they seek to take them over and rebuild them in their own image, not to preserve and protect a participatory and pluralist system, but to preserve their own policy and values priorities at the cost of others. Democracy needs preservation, and it needs constant repair to defend against our all too human inclination to take and retain power, but also to maintain the basic trust of the citizens who participatory government is meant to represent. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn to our esteemed panelists with the hope of unearthing not only a deeper understanding of the current challenges of the moment, but some concrete recommendations, I hope, for corrective pathways forward. It's been a great conversation. I know we still have lots of folks online. We have a few minutes for questions. We've raised a couple of really critical, I think, broad themes around democracy. To highlight some of them, one is about voice, equal voice. Is everyone feeling like they can be heard and affect a system? And are elections enough, frankly? And if not, what then? Equality before the law. Is the law independent? Is it representing all people regardless of who they are, where they're from, what they look like? Will they be held equally accountable, and will they have their rights equally protected? Freedom of conscience. Are people free to come to their own conclusions and express them without fear of retribution? And of course, we talked a lot now about information, and I think within information is the question of education and being able to discern truth, quote unquote, and I'll use a lowercase t for truth because I acknowledge there are not a lot of hard truths. Truths shift and change, but knowing what's really going on. And I'm a father of younger kids, and I watch how they use social media, a lot of which eludes me, but at the same time, I recognize just the overwhelming wealth of potential truths out there. And just my own reflection on this, it used to be that authoritarians felt controlling at people's access to information was the best way to control their minds. And now it seems like it's just flooding people with too much information, so folks just don't know what to believe anymore. And how do you operate within a democracy as an informed citizen, making informed choices, if you have no clue what the actual bedrock truths are that you're trying to operate around? So thank you all very much. It's been a great conversation. Let me start with one question off of from the crowd that's on Zoom, and thank you for that. It's a little bit about, I mean, the question, there are a bunch of questions that kind of cross over, but I think one of the big issues here is in the developing world, and how do we maintain standards of democracy in the developing world where democracy maybe is just emerging and is helping to be structured by the histories of the experience of democratic countries that have existed for a while? When those countries themselves and the international actors with power from big developed democracies maybe are not protecting democracy in their own space, how do they then help promote the growth and establishment of democracies abroad as we've been witnessing the decline of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism? Yeah, thank you for that. I realize there are a lot of other comments and questions, but unfortunately, with all respect, this is a good sign because it means that the content was really meaningful and everyone's excited about engaging. I'm going to have to invite all those things to happen offline right now because we have run out of time, and I apologize to my esteemed panelists. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, JWF and Rumi Forum, who had me come. And again, a round of applause for the panelists, please.